It's hard for us to imagine now, in a world where cartons wait in fluorescent aisles and refrigerators hum in every kitchen, just how strange milk once was. For most of human history, milk was not a product. It was an urgency. You milked the cow, or the goat, or the camel, and you drank it. Today, right now. Because by tomorrow, it would be something else entirely. Milk is fragile. Within hours it warms. It curdles. It blooms with invisible life. Modern science tells us that bacteria feast on its sugar, lactose, turning it sour almost as soon as it leaves the udder. Before refrigeration, before Louis Pasteur, nobody could explain it in those terms. But people knew the signs, the strange smell, the clumps, the stomach aches after drinking from the wrong bucket. They learned early to be wary. So across the ancient world, fresh milk was rare. The Romans kept cows and goats on estates. But if you lived in the city, milk didn't travel well. By the time it reached you, it was already spoiled. So the Romans, like the Greeks before them, relied mostly on cheese and yogurt, forms of milk that could be stored, sliced, packed for a march. In Pliny the Elder's Natural History, you find praise for sheep's milk cheese, not fresh cow's milk. Armies survived on cheese wheels, not bottles. The same was true elsewhere. In Central Asia, nomads fermented mare's milk into kumis, a tart, alcoholic drink that could last weeks. In the Arabian desert, Bedouin tribes treasured camel's milk, often sour, sometimes mixed with dates, a food for long journeys. In India, dairy was everywhere. Cows were sacred. Butter, ghee, was holy. But fresh milk was usually boiled the same day or transformed into yogurt and paneer. What unites all of these is the same instinct. Milk was too fragile to be trusted raw for long. In medieval Europe, that fragility turned into suspicion. Physicians working under the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, warned against milk. They thought it generated too much phlegm, weighed the body down, clogged the system. Adults avoided it. Fresh milk was considered a food for children, the sick, or the poor, who lived close to their cows. For everyone else, cheese, butter, or ale seemed safer. But that doesn't mean people never drank it. We have glimpses of it, mostly in the countryside. A 13th century English manuscript records payments to dairymaids who carried milk into town each morning, ladling it into buyers' pots. In Dutch paintings of the 17th century, you sometimes see milk pails in kitchens, still steaming from the cow, ready to be turned into custards or puddings. In London, milkmaids became familiar figures by the 1600s, their wooden yokes creaking under the weight of metal pails, selling raw milk door to door. There were even songs about them, some romantic, some bawdy, many mocking the thin, watered milk they carried. But there was no milkman not yet. These were individuals, not institutions. A farmer's wife, a girl from the village, a boy sent into town at dawn. They were solving today's problem. The cow gave milk this morning, and someone in town wanted it. Tomorrow, the problem would repeat. And in cities, the problem was sharper. By 1700, London had nearly 1 million residents. Paris wasn't far behind. New York was booming across the Atlantic. In these places, families with infants wanted milk, needed it. But the cows were gone, pushed out to the edges of town. That meant milk had to travel. And when milk traveled, it betrayed you. By the time it reached a child's mouth, it could already be poison. Imagine being a mother in 1750. You send your son with a coin to the corner to buy milk. He comes back with a small jug. You don't know if it's been watered down, or if the cow was diseased, or if the pail was rinsed in dirty water. You heat it. You taste it. You pray. Sometimes the child thrives. Sometimes he doesn't. This fragility shaped culture. In England, blue milk, so thin it was almost translucent, became a byword for weakness. In Germany, city ordinances appeared as early as the 18th century, warning sellers not to adulterate milk with water or flour. And everywhere, people knew that buying milk was a gamble. And yet, they kept buying it. Because milk was too valuable to give up. For infants, it was irreplaceable. For the poor, It was cheap calories. For the wealthy, it carried an air of rustic purity, a taste of the countryside in a city growing dirtier by the day. Enlightenment writers like Rousseau praised milk as the most natural of foods. In his vision of simple, honest living, milk was the drink of the virtuous. So by the late 18th century, milk was caught between two truths. It was fragile, risky, often deadly, and it was desirable, increasingly demanded by families in the world's growing cities. That tension between fragility and necessity is where our story begins. Before the bottle, before the white-coated man with a cart. Just a wooden pail, a morning walk, and a liquid that could not wait. The 17th century slid into the 18th, and the old European capitals began to swell in ways no city had before. London doubled, then doubled again. By 1800, more than 1 million people pressed against its crooked streets. Paris, Berlin, New York, all of them ballooned. A new kind of urban life was forming, and with it, new hungers. Among them was milk. Doctors began to speak of it not as rustic food for peasants, but as essential for children in the city. Reformers warned that malnourished infants grew into stunted adults. Pamphlets on child rearing recommended milk as a staple, and families, especially mothers, looked for it wherever they could find it. But here was the trouble. Cows were no longer nearby. In medieval towns, a family might have kept a cow in a yard or pastured just outside the walls. But in cities now teeming with hundreds of thousands, cows were pushed further and further out. Grassland turned into bricks and smoke, and so milk had to travel. That journey was perilous. A few hours on a cart in summer, and milk would sour. By the time it reached a tenement kitchen, it was already dangerous. And because demand outpaced supply, sellers often stretched it. A ladle of water, a pinch of flour, a swirl of chalk to whiten it again. If you lived in London around 1750, you'd know the figure of the milkmaid. She was an early riser, walking in from the outskirts with a wooden yoke across her shoulders, 2 metal pails clinking at her sides. She'd call out in the street, knocking on doors, pouring milk into waiting jugs. Sometimes she sang, sometimes she haggled. Poets praised their rosy cheeks. Satirists mocked their thin, watered milk. For many families, she was the only link to a cow. In Paris, there were vendors with handcarts who shouted their arrival in the narrow streets. They, too, often diluted their wares. In small American towns, farmers' wives sold milk directly from tin containers, fresh from the morning milking. But in big cities, these informal networks began to fray. There were too many mouths to feed, too much money to be made, too many shortcuts to be tempted by. The result was often sickness. Diaries from London in the 1700s record children taken ill after drinking milk that had gone over. German city ordinances tried to rein in fraud. In Amsterdam, authorities tested sellers' buckets for added water. Everyone knew the risk, but the alternative, no milk at all, was worse. And yet milk's reputation was shifting. To Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, it became a symbol of purity, of a return to nature. In his writings on education, he urged mothers to nurse their children longer, to keep milk as a foundation of health. His ideal child was raised on milk, fruit, and bread, not the fancy confections of aristocratic Paris. In paintings of the era, milkmaids stood for rustic virtue. So, demand grew. In cities, in villages, across the Atlantic in America, milk became more than an occasional luxury. It was part of daily life. But the gap between what families wanted, clean, nourishing milk, and what sellers provided, fragile, often adulterated milk, widened with every passing year. By the early 1800s, that gap was becoming impossible to ignore. Cities had new classes of workers, new tenements packed with children, new reformers watching infant mortality rise, and all of them were asking the same question. If milk is essential, why is it so unsafe? That question would come to a head in the middle of the 19th century, in scandals that shocked entire nations. But already, in the decades before, the stage was set. The city had grown. Milk had become a problem, and the people who carried it from cow to child, the milkmaids, the vendors, the farmers' wives, were no longer enough. Something else was needed. By the middle of the 19th century, milk wasn't just a country food anymore. It had become part of urban life. Families expected it. Doctors prescribed it. Reformers insisted children needed it. But the very scale of that demand created something monstrous. The problem was geography. Manhattan, by the 1850s, was a city of more than 500,000 people. You couldn't keep enough cows inside its borders to supply them. Green pasture had been paved over. Land was too valuable to waste on grazing. And trains from upstate New York and New Jersey brought only so much, only so fast. So the city improvised, and what it improvised was swill milk. Picture the scene. A whiskey distillery on the west side of Manhattan. Its furnaces blazing day and night, boiling grain mash into liquor. The waste, steaming, wet, acrid, poured out in rivers. It couldn't be eaten by humans. It couldn't be thrown away cheaply. But it could, at least for a while, be fed to cows. So entrepreneurs built dairies right next door. Thousands of cattle were packed into dark, airless stables. They ate nothing but the hot refuse. They grew sick. Their hides sagged. Their eyes oozed. Their legs sometimes snapped under their own weight. They were milked until they collapsed. And when they collapsed, they were often left to rot, right there in the pen, as the others kept producing. The milk that came out of these cows was thin, bluish, bitter. It looked wrong, tasted wrong, but there was money to be made, and appearance was everything. So dealers doctored it. They poured in water. They stirred in starch or flour to thicken it, chalk to whiten it, molasses to sweeten it. Some even added plaster dust. By the time it was ladled into a jug for a mother in the 5 Points neighborhood, it looked almost convincing, but it killed children. Doctors began to take note. In some wards of New York, infant mortality reached horrifying levels. Reformers estimated that more than 8,000 children a year died from tainted milk. Newspapers carried heartbreaking stories. A baby nursed on swill milk, dead within days. Whole families losing 2, 3 children in a single season. At first, the scandal was whispered. Everyone knew the milk tasted strange. Everyone suspected dilution. But in 1858, the truth exploded into public view. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, one of the most popular weeklies in America, ran a series of exposés. Reporters infiltrated the swill dairies. Sketch artists drew the cows, hollow-backed, sores on their legs, standing knee-deep in manure. They drew the children too, emaciated, clutching bottles labeled swill milk, with a skull and crossbones stamped across. The public reaction was immediate. Outrage. Sermons thundered from pulpits. Reform meetings filled halls. Mothers marched with petitions. Even the language changed. Swill milk became a shorthand for corruption and greed, a symbol of how industry could poison the very food that sustained life. But reform was not easy. Milk dealers defended themselves. They insisted poor families needed cheap milk, that if swill dairies were shut down, children would starve. Politicians hesitated. Many were entangled with the distillery owners. New York's Common Council debated, delayed, watered down proposals. In the meantime, children kept dying. And then, across the Atlantic, another story was unfolding. In France, Louis Pasteur was proving through experiments that fermentation and disease were caused by microbes, organisms too small to see. His work on wine and beer would soon transform the way the world thought about milk. Pasteurization, heating milk to kill bacteria, was just years away. But in the 1850s, that knowledge hadn't yet reached New York. The city was trapped between fragile supply and corrupt industry. For parents, it was a cruel gamble. Buy the cheap swill milk and risk your child's life, or pay dearly for country milk shipped in by train, if you could even find it. The swill milk scandal did more than shock. It left scars. It taught urban families that milk could not simply be taken on faith. It demanded oversight, cleanliness, responsibility. And it burned into the public imagination the idea that milk required a guardian, someone whose job it was not just to deliver it, but to deliver it safely. That need for ritual, for reliability, for trust, is what gave birth to the milkman as we know him. The milkman was not invented by accident. He was born out of fear, out of the swill milk scandal, out of babies' graves, out of the sudden realization that milk was too important to leave to chance. If families were to trust it, someone had to embody that trust. And so, at the turn of the 20th century, he arrived. Picture New York in the 1890s. It's 3 in the morning. Horses stamp and snort in the chill air. Men in caps and heavy coats load glass bottles into wicker baskets, then into wagons. Lanterns swing. Drivers cluck their tongues and climb aboard. By dawn, the city will be alive with clinking glass. The bottles themselves were a revolution. For centuries, milk had been carried in open pails, ladled into whatever jug a family brought. Contamination was inevitable. But in the 1870s, dairymen began to experiment with glass. The New York Dairy Company introduced sealed bottles with paper caps in 1878. A man named Hervey Thatcher patented one of the earliest widely used milk bottles, the Sir Thatcher Milk Protector. The very name tells you the point. Protect the milk from tampering, from filth, from swill. These bottles changed everything. A bottle was uniform. A bottle could be sterilized, reused, trusted. A bottle looked clean in a way a dented pail never could. And when it appeared on your doorstep in the morning, it felt like proof that someone cared about the journey. The milkman became part of the ritual. He rose before the rest of the city, often at 2 or 3 in the morning. His workday was nearly finished by the time office clerks were lacing their shoes. He knew his route as intimately as he knew his own house. Which family needed extra cream on Sundays? Which widow left her empties lined up on the left side of the stoop instead of the right? Which children waited by the porch to wave? In London, by the 1920s, the milkman was so central that nearly every household relied on one. The British milk float, first horse-drawn, later electric, became part of the soundscape of mornings. People remembered the quiet hum of the float and the hollow knock of bottles against one another. Even in wartime, during the Blitz, milkmen carried on. There are stories of them stepping over rubble, delivering bottles to houses with no windows left, as if to say, yes, bombs fall, but children still drink. In America, the suburban milkman became a symbol of stability. In the 1940s and 1950s, advertising leaned into it. The white-coated man, clean, efficient, part of the perfect domestic scene. A bottle on the porch was more than food. It was reassurance that the world was orderly, that life was predictable. But this trust wasn't automatic. It had to be earned daily. Milkmen handled keys left under mats, notes scrawled in pencil tucked into empty bottles. In some neighborhoods, they kept informal credit accounts. A family struggling 1 week might still get their milk, with payment delayed until next payday. The milkman wasn't just a delivery man. He was a neighbor, woven into the social fabric of a block. And his work was brutally hard. Rising in the dead of night, hauling crates of heavy glass, trudging miles in snow and rain. Horses had to be cared for, wagons cleaned, bottles washed and sterilized. Breakage was constant, injuries common. And yet the milkman carried with him an aura of dignity. He was the guardian of the morning. The economics of it foreshadowed our subscription culture today. Families didn't order ad hoc. They had standing arrangements, 3 bottles a week, a quart of cream every other day. Adjustments came through notes left in empties. It was the 19th century's version of a recurring subscription, and it worked because of trust. And slowly, the milkman seeped into culture. Into jokes, the endless quip about the milkman's baby. Into songs and postcards, British ones often cheeky, portraying milkmen as objects of flirtation. Into film and comedy sketches in America, where the idea of the milkman's quiet, daily presence became an easy punchline. These cultural echoes only made sense because the milkman was universal. Everyone had one. Everyone knew the sound of bottles at dawn. Think of the texture of that sound. The crunch of wagon wheels on gravel, the faint jingle of harness chains, the sudden clink as a bottle touched stone. For many children, it was the first sound of morning. For many adults, the silent reassurance that the day had begun. That's what the milkman gave. Not just milk, but rhythm. In a world that was still adjusting to industrial noise, to chaos and crowds, here was one thing you could count on. A bottle, cold, and waiting, exactly where it should be. This was the height of his reign, the first half of the 20th century. The milkman as ritual, as neighbor, as icon of trust. Soon, refrigerators and supermarkets would come to unseat him. But before that, for a few decades, he was as much a part of daily life as the sunrise itself. By the early 20th century, the milkman was no longer invisible. He had become part of the imagination. The man in white with his wire basket and clinking bottles was as familiar as the postman. And because he was universal, he became symbolic. In Britain, his role reached almost legendary proportions during the Second World War. When the Blitz began in 1940, the city braced itself for chaos. But milk deliveries continued. Newspapers marveled at it. One London headline read, "Milk delivered daily, even under fire." Diaries describe surreal scenes, a street flattened by bombs, rubble still smoking, and yet bottles lined neatly on stoops. A London mother later recalled in an oral history interview, "We lost our roof on a Tuesday night." Wednesday morning, the milkman came as usual. He set the bottles right where the doorstep had been. We laughed, because what else can you do? The government recognized the symbolism. Posters showed smiling milkmen under the slogan, "Milk, the backbone of Britain." In wartime rationing, milk was prioritized for children and expectant mothers. The milkman became more than a delivery man. He was the guardian of the nation's health. In America, the figure took on a different cultural shine. By the 1940s and 50s, the milkman was part of the suburban dream. Lawn, porch, picket fence, bottles at dawn. Advertisements wrapped him in wholesome imagery. "The milkman, freshness on wheels," read one campaign. Another, "Your dairy friend." The image was always the same. A smiling man, white uniform, cap tipped politely, holding out a bottle that seemed to glow. The reality was harder. Milkmen woke at 2 in the morning, heaved heavy glass crates, drove icy roads in the dark. But in the public mind, he represented steadiness, a neighbor who never failed. Children grew up listening for the crunch of wagon wheels or the whir of an electric float, the sharp clink of bottles being set down. That sound was memory itself. Oral histories from post-war Britain are full of it. One man recalled, "The floats were silent, electric, you see, but you always heard the bottles. That knock, that clatter, that was the sound of morning." The trust ran deep. Families left doors unlocked, keys hidden under mats, notes tucked in empty bottles. The notes themselves were small artifacts of intimacy. "To today, extra cream," or "None tomorrow, we'll be away." The milkman followed instructions wordlessly, almost invisibly. And because he was everywhere, he slipped into humor. The milkman's baby joke, implying that a child suspiciously unlike its father must really be the milkman's, was repeated endlessly in Britain and America. It showed up in courtrooms, in vaudeville routines, in television sitcoms. By the 1950s, it was a cliché. But clichés only work when everyone shares the reference point. The milkman's constant presence in family life made him the perfect foil for comedy. There were cheekier portrayals too. British postcards from the 1920s often depicted milkmen as flirts, winking at housewives. One showed a smiling milkman handing over bottles with the caption, "Fresh and early." In America, comics used him as shorthand for ordinariness, the everyman against whom absurd plots could unfold. But beneath the humor lay something profound. The milkman was trusted enough to enter families' most private rhythms. He came before fathers were awake, before doors were locked, before the city stirred. He was part of the domestic fabric, as close to the family as the bread box. And beyond Europe and America, the archetype existed too. In India, milk delivery was often done by bicycle, men balancing heavy metal containers, ladling milk into household pots. In Kenya, runners carried jerry cans at dawn. In the Middle East, camel's milk was still delivered by men who walked miles. The methods varied, but the role was the same: to carry something fragile from animal to household, day after day, in trust. In all these places, the milkman became shorthand for dependability. He was the figure who showed that life went on, even under bombs, even in hardship, even in the most private moments of family life. To see him on the street was to know that the day had begun. To hear the clink of his bottles was to feel order restored. That is what made him an icon, not just a man with a cart, but the embodiment of rhythm, of nourishment, of continuity in a world that so often broke apart. For decades, the clink of bottles at dawn was as ordinary as the rising sun. And then, almost suddenly, it began to fade. The killer wasn't scandal this time. It wasn't swill milk, or fraud, or war. It was technology, the refrigerator. Before fridges, milk had to arrive daily. Even on ice, it couldn't last more than a day or two. That's what made the milkman indispensable. His rhythm was biology's rhythm. But as early as the 1920s, electric refrigerators began creeping into middle-class homes in America. By the 1940s, wartime production had slowed adoption, but after 1945, the floodgates opened. Soldiers returned home, suburbs sprawled, and refrigerators were sold in the millions. By 1955, more than 80% of American households had one. In Britain, the shift was slower but steady. By the 1970s, the fridge was nearly universal. A fridge meant you could buy milk once a week and keep it cold. You didn't need bottles clinking at your door every dawn. Supermarkets delivered the second blow. In the early 20th century, most people still bought staples from neighborhood shops. Bread here, meat there, produce at a stall. Milk was special enough to require its own route. But the rise of the one-stop supermarket in the 1950s and 60s collapsed those rituals. You could grab milk alongside everything else, parked neatly in cartons in long, humming aisles. Convenience trumped ritual. And then came packaging. Glass bottles, so long the symbol of cleanliness and trust, gave way to paper cartons, and later, plastic jugs. They were lighter, cheaper, disposable. Families didn't have to rinse and return. For dairies, it was easier. No more chasing down empties. No more breakage. But something vanished with the shift. The quiet exchange between household and milkman. By the late 1960s, delivery numbers in America plummeted. In 1963, nearly 30% of U.S. milk was still delivered to doorsteps. By the mid-1980s, it was under 7%. In Britain, the decline lagged. Milk floats still hummed through suburbs into the 1980s and 1990s. But even there, supermarkets and fridges won. And so the figure of the milkman began to vanish. For the men themselves, the collapse was brutal. Whole careers disappeared. Wages shrank. Routes were cut. Companies consolidated. One former milkman recalled, "You went from being part of the family's life to being unnecessary overnight. I folded my uniform, and that was that." For families, the change was quieter, but no less profound. The dawn clink of bottles gave way to the low hum of the refrigerator. The soundscape of morning shifted. A ritual that had stitched together generations. The knock, the note in the empty, the horse's breath in the cold, was gone. And in its place came a new culture of consumption. Plastic jugs stacked in supermarkets, standardized, anonymous, disconnected from any face or neighbor. Milk became just another commodity, stripped of ritual, stripped of intimacy. Of course, some milkmen carried on. In parts of Britain, routes survived well into the 2000s, partly because of tradition, partly because of loyalty. A 1990s survey found that in some villages, people kept their milkmen out of nostalgia as much as need. In America, a few regional dairies held on, serving customers who still wanted the glass bottle on the porch. But they were the exceptions. The truth was clear. By the end of the 20th century, the milkman, once a symbol of trust and continuity, was fading into memory. And yet, memory is powerful, which is why, as the milkman declined, he didn't vanish completely. He lingered as an image, in jokes, in nostalgia, in the smell of glass bottles washed and reused. And in time, that nostalgia would matter more than anyone expected. Because the story of the milkman doesn't quite end here. There's one more act. The milkman should have vanished. By the end of the 20th century, the refrigerator had won, the supermarket had conquered, and the plastic jug had replaced the glass bottle. By every economic measure, the job was obsolete. And yet, he never disappeared completely. In Britain, the milk float still hummed through suburban streets into the 1990s, long after many assumed the trade was dead. Partly it was tradition, partly it was loyalty. Families who had known their milkman for decades didn't want to let go. They liked the bottles on the step, the small talk at dawn, the sense of continuity. But the 21st century brought something else: revival. In London today, you can still find milkmen, not just relics, but busy. Companies like Milk and More deliver to hundreds of thousands of households. Their pitch? Sustainability. Glass bottles again, reusable, less waste than plastic. And nostalgia. The soft knock at dawn, the clink on the step, the rhythm of a service that once seemed gone forever. In the US, small dairies have revived the model too. In New York, Brooklyn families can subscribe to glass-bottled milk from local farms. In Portland, Oregon, delivery services advertise themselves as bringing back the milkman experience. These aren't accidents. They're part of a broader trend, the return of subscription delivery. Because in a strange way, the milkman was the prototype of our modern economy. Netflix, Spotify, Amazon Subscribe, and Save. All of them run on the same principle. A recurring delivery, a standing order, something you don't have to think about because it just appears. The milkman did that first, with bottles of milk. And now, in the age of sustainability and nostalgia, he returns. Not on every street, not for every family, but as a reminder that convenience and ritual can coexist. There's something deeper too. We live in a world of frictionless consumption. Tap your phone, groceries arrive. But in that smoothness, people miss the texture. They miss the small rituals. The knock on the door, the note tucked in a bottle, the neighborly face in the morning fog. The milkman represents not just delivery, but presence. It's why he lingers in culture, long after his roots declined. The jokes remain, the milkman's baby, the flirty postcards. The nostalgia remains, childhood memories of bottle clinks. And the archetype remains, the idea of a trusted stranger who arrives quietly at dawn, carrying nourishment. The milkman, in other words, never belonged only to milk. He belonged to ritual, to rhythm, to the fragile dance between fragility and trust. And those things never really vanish. So perhaps it's fitting that in our world of glowing screens and silent apps, the milkman should echo back. On bicycles with glass bottles, in electric vans at dawn, in stories of grandmothers who still swear by doorstep milk. He is reminder and metaphor both, that even the simplest foods carry histories of fear, trust, scandal, ritual, collapse, and return. And so we end where we began. In the silence before dawn, a street not yet awake, the faint clink of bottles on stone, a sound so small you could miss it, and yet, for more than a century, it was the sound of life continuing, day after day. From The Milkman.